Good evening. Tonight I'm going to continue on with the Rosarium pictures from The Mystery of the Coniunctio, Alchemical Image of Individuation. And this will be pictures 2 and 3 out of 10. And so picture 2 is on the screen with me here. Here we have a robed king and queen, each crowned. The king stands on the sun and the queen stands on the moon. They hold each other's left hand, and in the right hand of each there are long-stemmed flowers which cross. Above them is a six-pointed star. Since this star is central, we can assume it derives from the fifth quintessential star of the first picture. Below the star, a dove descends with another flower in its beak, which crosses the two other crossed flower stems. In the first picture, we had a representation of the original unity, and now the unity has been split into two. The king and the queen face each other. There's a confrontation, and that confrontation takes place under the motivation of a third thing, the dove. So in comparison to picture 1, this represents a separatio corresponding to the original act of creation that separated light from darkness. That's a very frequent theme of creation myths. In the beginning, there was just a confused composite mixture of things, and then a divine intervention caused a division, separating the earth from the sky. In this case, it is the sun from the moon. The creative act of separatio means consciousness has been born, and consciousness means human beings. Therefore, in picture 2, we have for the first time the presence of humanity, but they're not quite ordinary human beings. They're not persons yet. From the way they're represented, it's clear that they are archetypal entities rather than individuals. That's indicated in 2 ways. First of all, they're standing on the sun and the moon. Secondly, they are royalty, represented by the crowns and robes. One might say the fact that they're standing on the sun and the moon indicates that they represent Sol and Luna as reflected in human consciousness. Also, we should understand Sol and Luna in light of general alchemical symbolism to refer to all pairs of opposites. The dove is a very interesting phenomenon here. It's clearly the instigator of the whole ensuing drama. I see it as playing something of the same role as the serpent played in the Garden of Eden. I've already mentioned that the Annunciation parallels this picture. The dove of the Holy Ghost was involved here. Now, let me give you the Annunciation. There's a couple of images of the Annunciation which I have footnoted in the description below. And as those of you who have heard me talk on the symbolism of the Annunciation will remember, that symbolism has definite analogies to the temptation in the Garden of Eden. The angelic presences seen in the De Paoli painting above, the top one, at the Annunciation and in the Garden of Eden are 2 manifestations of the same psychological reality. Here it is again in picture 2. The dove has 2 major symbolic references. Oops, I guess I didn't give you that. Let me give you that back. Okay, so those are the 2 paintings of the Annunciation. Now let me picture 2 back. Okay. The dove has 2 major symbolic references. The Holy Ghost is one, and the dove of Aphrodite is the other. So symbolically, these 2 different aspects are put together into one paradoxical image. Now that's a union of opposites in itself. The promptings of Aphrodite and the promptings of the Holy Ghost usually aren't thought of as identical. Psychologically, this would mean the beginning of the Coniunctio is set off by an ardent desire. Aphrodite is the mother of desires, and this desire is at the same time an annunciation of the Holy Ghost. That the dove descends from the star indicates that it's a messenger from the transpersonal or cosmic self. You see, desire impels us toward an object in anticipation of pleasure, whereas an annunciation is an assignment of a difficult task. It's an opus. Those who are actually the same thing, and the way one experiences either depends on the level of psychological development. So I might just add that in our current affairs, when the president and Nancy Pelosi are the pair of opposites, we're seeing an experience like that right on our screens today. In youth, we follow our desires with relative abandon until experience teaches us to know better. But in the course of individuation, we learn that to follow one's libido consciously becomes a heavy task, an opus. And in this picture, these 2 aspects of the relation of the ego to transpersonal libido are united in the single image of the dove. You might say it's a union of work and play. You remember I said that there were 3 ways we can take these pictures: as a process within the individual, as process within a relationship between 2 people, or as process within a collectivity. It's very interesting to me that in the ancient Greek grammar, there were 3 numbers. No wonder the teaching of ancient Greek has gone out of fashion. Not only are there singular and plural forms to learn, you also have dual forms. So there's single, dual, and plural. If the reference is to one person, you use the singular form. If it is to 2 people, you use a dual form. And if it's to more than 2, 3, or many, you use the plural. The language crystallizes out in early development is an expression of the phenomenology of the psyche. So this Greek grammatical structure is an example of the same thing I'm doing here, interpreting these pictures in 3 modes: single, dual, and plural. 1, you're alone; 2's company; 3's a crowd. I should remind you of another feature: the activation of libido that the dove represents may be either positive or negative, an attraction or a hatred, as in today's fight between Nancy Pelosi and the president over whether he will give the State of the Union speech. Enmity promotes Coniunctio just as well, maybe even better than love does. They are 2 sides of the same phenomenon, which is illustrated in Greek mythology by the fact that Ares, the god of war, and Aphrodite, the god of love, were lovers. Let's consider how we might understand picture 2 from the 3 different standpoints. As a process within the individual, this is not completely accurate psychologically, as these things are very fluid and variable. One way of thinking of it that will be partially true, at least sometimes, is that the male figure represents a man's ego and the female figure represents a woman's ego. I don't recommend identifying with those figures as a psychological process, but the fact is that we do. We fall into such identifications and then discover our mistake retrospectively and have to alter our ideas. With that idea in mind, from the individual standpoint, such a picture could be saying something like this: the ego, having been goaded by Aphrodite and the Holy Ghost, is gripped by an intense, affective urgency, either desire or hatred, for something that derives from the anima or animus. The anima and animus are the personifications of our passionate desires because they're the gateway to the unconscious. Those figures will say, go for that, or oh, that's terrible. From this standpoint, picture 2 would represent the initial phase of that goading by an effect of positive or negative desirousness. That would be the individual mode. Considered as a relationship between two people, we could see it as a picture of a person being gripped by a passion of love or hate for another person. It's the initial move to touch, either to incorporate or destroy, that person who has aroused the affective intensity. You know very often that move toward another in so-called love actually has as its basis a desire to incorporate, take over, consume, swallow. In the third way of seeing it, as a process within a social collective, the picture would represent two groups or factions that are motivated to confront each other. Such an event is almost always in enmity. You don't get a lot of loving connections between two groups within a single collective. So the initial encounter will be with the intention to destroy. Nonetheless, this desire to destroy the opponent, the other, derives from an unconscious Coniunctio urge. I'm reminded of a bird that keeps showing up outside my window. It can see its reflection in the window, and it can't leave it alone. It has to attack that reflection, and its persistence is just astonishing. This has been going on for weeks. I cannot stand the presence of a second, and I think of this picture. But its behavior does derive from a Coniunctio image. The urge to annihilate the second is a desire to reestablish unity. To understand all empire building, for instance, as deriving from the Coniunctio urge, I understand all empire building, for instance, as deriving from the Coniunctio urge. It's misplaced because it's ego-centered, but I think that's what gave Alexander the Great his impetus. He had a vision, a very premature one, of one world, and although it was acted out in identification with the ego, I'm convinced he was serving an archetypal principle. The image comes up often in dreams. Two figures meet in a dream and have some superficial initial encounters. Meetings of the ego and the shadow, for example, or sometimes of ego and anima or animus, or the meeting of two non-ego figures. But initial meetings happen all the time. Okay, so that is image number 2. And now let me give you image number 3. We have the same two crowned figures standing on the sun and the moon, and now their clothing is removed. The nature of their connection is also different. No longer are they holding left hands, which signifies an unconscious connection. Instead, they are connected by the two flowers they mutually hold. The dove is still above with its additional flower crossing the other flowers. The star is missing and is replaced by its earthly embodiment, the sixfold star flower, which connects the two figures. I think the flowers are primarily a reference to the erotic aspect of the motivating energy. In dreams, flowers generally point to two major ideas. When a single flower is emphasized, it's very often a mandala image, since flowers are natural mandalas. The other idea is that flowers represent nature's capacity to attract. They are a manifestation of beauty, allure. Presumably, from the teleological standpoint, that's why a plant generates flowers. They lure creatures to it that then serve its purposes. So psychologically considered, flowers would represent the beautiful bait that the unconscious holds out to the ego in order to lure it into the process of individuation, and one hopes that it's not a Venus flytrap. In this picture, something new has been added. We have words. There were words in picture 1, but they were sort of disembodied because there was no human consciousness to read them. Here, each of the three figures is making a statement. We have language. This indicates that some significant changes have taken place in the encounter between those two opposites. On the scrolls, Sol is saying, "O Luna, let me be thy husband." Luna says, "O soul, I must submit to thee." And the dove says, "The spirit is what unifies." Or in another version of the same picture, the dove says, "The spirit is what vivifies." Now, as I mentioned, the left hands are no longer touching and the star has disappeared. As I understand it, the six-pointed star from the first two pictures has translated itself from the upper region of the space between the two figures. We now have a six-pointed figure held between the two figures and the dove. We had the beginnings of that six-pointed figure in picture 2, but it wasn't yet completely joined because of the left-handed connection. The two figures weren't completely committed to the sixfold connection, but now they are. That suggests to me that the star, evidence of a transpersonal or cosmic dimension, has now been constellated in the relationship between Sol and Luna. This would correspond to the incarnation of deity. You see, the descent of the transpersonal content into the vessel of the relationship between these two figures. Or you could say that the Imago Dei has fallen into the human realm. I'm reminded of a couple of remarks of Jung's about this in answer to Job. He says, quote, "All opposites are of God. Therefore, man must bend to this burden, and in so doing, he finds that God in his oppositeness has taken possession of him, incarnated himself in him. He becomes a vessel filled with divine conflict. God acts out the unconscious of man and forces him to harmonize and unite the opposing influences to which his mind is exposed from the unconscious." End quote. Let's consider what picture 3 might mean in terms of 3 modes of experience. First, within an individual, it would indicate that the opposites have been constellated and consciously engaged, and that there has been a commitment to a particular enterprise. I might, for instance, be It might, for instance, be a commitment to pursue the desired object of some kind. It would be a person, it could be a car, it could be a profession, it could be anything big or little. It could represent a decision to engage the unconscious in some serious way, to go with it. These Rosarium images can apply to many different magnitudes of importance, but it will represent a commitment to follow an intense effect, either positive or negative. So in picture 3, what was represented in picture 2 as an unconscious urge becomes a conscious decision. The left-handed unconscious connection has ceased. As a process going on within a relationship, it would suggest that the two participants have shed their personas and are now approaching each other with what Jung calls a naked truth. They're now mutually committed to pursuing the relationship. They're not just flirting, as they were in picture 2. Psychological intimacy is beginning, and the third thing, the transpersonal star, is constellated between them. It will live itself out in some way or other, for good or for ill. Now, I would argue that that is what's happening between the president and Nancy Pelosi right now. Considered as a process within a collective, it would suggest that the two opposing factions have revealed their open enmity. Their personas of politeness have been stripped. They reveal their real attitude toward each other, and the prospect of war is escalating. Images of this sort show up in dreams quite often. Nakedness in dreams is so common that it was even the basis of a commercial many years ago. I dreamt I was in my maiden form bra in some public place. Very often, such an image refers to a faulty persona and indicates that the individual is headed for the bathwaters unintentionally. One doesn't know what one is doing. Such dreams then remind the person, wait a minute, did you really intend to embark on this process, or have you just blundered into it by mistake? If it's a blunder, get your clothes back on. But at other times, the image of nakedness in dreams means psychological honesty. All pretenses have been stripped away, and the process is going to proceed in earnest. And at this point, Dr. Edinger provides, well, there's another image that's not very clear, but it's this, which is a flower, the golden flower of alchemy, as birthplace of the Philosophorum from the Ripley Scrowle, 1588. And so that's the extent of my reading for today. It's nice to see you all here. And Art asks if he is the only one. As of right now, Art, there are 10 people watching. I don't know if they've all been here from the beginning, but they're here now. And Sean says, when someone is resentful, I feel it's very hard to read past their initial intention. Although you can see it bleeding out of them from miles away, they seem like stiff stones. Yeah, that's fair enough. I know it's just my perception, and there is actually much more beneath the surface, but it is hidden. Various readings, and Sean says, when you go up to the opposite sex and don't use your intuition, you can easily feel the stiff weight and stone-like a presence. Yeah. You think. And Zen Christ, welcome. Okay, I have promised my wife that I would be available for dinner in 3 minutes, so that means I have to cut short here, but this video will be available for replay shortly. Thank you for joining me today.